Chapter 2 starts our study on the chemical basis of life. So when we get to Chapter 2, we have a little discussion on life as a chemistry component and what that involves. So that kind of gets us started in the introduction to the chapter. So living organisms are made of atoms of certain elements, mostly combined into compounds. And the structure of an atom determines what type of bonds it can form with another atom. So the unique properties of water derive from the polarity and hydrogen bonding of water molecules. And coral reefs are among the most diverse ecosystems on Earth. They are formed from the gradual buildup of the calcium carbonate skeletons of small coral animals. So as you can see in the photos in your textbook of the coral reefs, these structures are very diverse habitats, and they provide havens for a huge diversity of fish and other marine organisms. But in the recent years, something in the air is threatening the coral reefs. How might a chemical compound in the air harm such a vibrant ecosystem? Well, the answer is chemistry. When carbon dioxide dissolves in water, it reacts with water to form an acid, which then makes the water more acidic. So later in the chapter, we will see how scientists are exploring the effects of this ocean acidification on coral reefs. So elements, atoms, and compounds. So living organisms are composed of matter, and matter is composed of chemical elements. There are about 25 elements that are essential for human life, and 4 elements make up about 96% of the weight of most living organisms. So when we discuss this, we need to understand that you and all things around you are made of matter. That's the physical stuff of the universe. Matter is defined as anything that occupies space and has mass. So matter is found on Earth in 3 physical states: solid, liquid, or gas. Types of matter as diverse as rocks, water, air, and biology students are all composed of chemical elements. An element is a substance that cannot be broken down to other substances by ordinary chemical means. Chemists recognize that 92 elements occur in nature. Gold, copper, carbon, and oxygen are some of those examples. Chemists also have made a few dozen synthetic elements, and each element has a symbol made up of the first letter or 2 of its English, Latin, or German name. For example, oxygen, the symbol is a capital O. And in English, of course, that word is oxygen. In Latin, for example, sodium, Na, the symbol Na means sodium in English, but in Latin it's natrium. So that is its given symbol on the periodic table. A compound is a substance consisting of 2 or more different elements combined in a fixed ratio. For example, table salt has equal parts of the elements sodium and chlorine. Pure sodium is a metal and pure chlorine is a poisonous gas. Chemically combined, however, they form an edible compound. In this figure, we see hydrogen and oxygen are elements that typically exist as gas, chemically combined in a ratio of 2 to 1. However, they form the most abundant compound on the surface of the earth, water. Water and table salt are examples of organized matter having emergent properties. A compound has characteristics different from those of its elements. Most of the compounds in living organisms contain at least 3 or 4 elements. Sugar, for example, is formed of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Proteins, which make up about 20% of your body, are compounds containing carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and a small amount of sulfur. So how many elements are essential for life? The requirements are similar among organisms, but there is some variation. For example, humans need 25 elements, but plants require only 17. So as you can see in this figure, 6 elements, oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, calcium, and phosphorus, make up about 99% of your body. The first 4, being oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, and nitrogen, are the main ingredients of the biological molecules, proteins, carbohydrates, and lipids. Calcium and phosphorus are the major components of your bones and teeth. Accounting for most of the remaining 1% of your body, potassium, sulfur, sodium, chlorine, and magnesium are involved in functions such as nerve signaling and chemical reactions. So what about the last tip of the toe in this figure? Well, the so-called trace elements are present in minute quantities, making up less than 0.01% of human body weight. They include boron, chromium, cobalt, copper, fluorine, iodine, iron, manganese, molybdenum, selenium, silicon, tin, vanadium, and zinc. Iron makes up only about 0.004% of your body weight, but is vital for energy processing and for transporting oxygen in your blood. Iron is a trace element needed by all forms of life. Others are required only by certain species. For example, iodine is essential only for vertebrates, animals with backbones, which include you. So we explore the importance of trace elements to your health coming up next. So trace elements are common additives to food and water. So trace elements are required in very small quantities, but in some cases, even those small requirements are difficult to fulfill. Iodine is an essential component of a hormone produced by the thyroid gland. An iodine deficiency in the diet causes the thyroid gland to grow to abnormal size, a condition which is called a goiter. The most serious effects of iodine deficiency take place during fetal development and childhood, leading to miscarriages, poor growth, and mental impairment. Seafood, kelp, dairy products, and dark leafy greens are good natural sources of iodine. Deficiencies are often found in inland regions, especially in areas where the soil is lacking in iodine. A global strategy to eliminate iodine deficiency involves universal iodization of all salt used for human and animal consumption. Unfortunately, about 30% of global households still do not have access to iodized salt. Although most common in developing nations, iodine deficiencies may also result from excessive consumption of highly processed foods. A deficiency in another trace element is iron, and this is the world's most common nutritional disorder, with as many as 2 billion people affected, in particular children and women in developing countries. Strategies for addressing the challenge of iron deficiency include food fortification, iron supplements, and diet diversification and improvement. Trace elements have also been added to water to improve public health. Fluoride, for example, is a form of fluorine, which is found in small amounts in all water sources. For more than 70 years, the American Dental Association has supported fluoridization of community drinking water. Indeed, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, listed water fluoridation as one of 10 great public health achievements of the 20th century. The history of water fluoridation illustrates both the process of science and societal benefits and interactions. This is a photo of a goiter, which is what would result in a deficiency of iodine in the diet. And again, we talked about that being very important for the thyroid gland. So when we have a deficiency of it, it causes the thyroid gland to grow abnormally in size. In this next section, we discuss atoms consisting of protons, neutrons, and electrons. So each element has its own type of an atom, which is different from the atoms of other elements. An atom is the smallest unit of matter that still retains the properties of an element. Atoms are so small that it would take about 1 million of them to stretch across the period printed at the end of the sentence. Physics have split the atom into more than 100 types of subatomic particles. However, only 3 kinds of particles are relevant to us. A proton, which is a subatomic particle with a single positive electric charge, an electron, which is a subatomic particle with a single negative charge, and then there's a neutron, and it is electrically neutral. It has no charge. So we notice that the protons and the neutrons are tightly packed in the atom's center core, or also called the nucleus. We need to understand that there are multiple, depending on the atom that you're dealing with, but you can have two, you can have three, however many electrons that atom has. Those electrons are moving around that nucleus in orbit. So they form a sort of cloud of negative charges around the nucleus. Now, the attraction between the negatively charged electrons and the positively charged protons holds the electrons near the nucleus. So what makes the atoms of different elements different? All atoms of a particular element have the same unique number of protons. This number is the element's atomic number. So what other numbers are associated with an atom? Well, we have a mass number, and the mass number is the sum of the protons and neutrons in the nucleus. So the mass of a proton and the mass of a neutron are almost identical and are expressed in a unit of measurement called the Dalton. So an atomic mass is approximately equal to its atomic weight, or atomic mass is its mass number, which is the sum of protons and neutrons. All atoms of an element have the same atomic number, but some atoms of that element may differ in a mass number. The different isotopes, that they're called, of an element have the same number of protons and behave identically in chemical reactions, but they have different numbers of neutrons. So in this photo here, you see our nucleus. You can see inside the nucleus, you will find your proton and your neutron, and then orbiting outside in the electrical orbits are the electrons. Here's a photo of an isotope. So as I mentioned, the isotope only varies in number of neutrons. So you have the same element. The element is carbon, but you have different forms of carbon, meaning the mass number is going to vary. Just like if we were to weigh every day, our weight would vary. When elements the same way, you could look at a periodic table on one internet source and get a mass number of 12.0111, which would round to 12 for carbon, and then another one you might get 12.9, and that would round to 13, and then another one you might get 13.6, which would round to 14. So all of those are still the element carbon. You still have the same number of electrons and the same number of protons, which that is the atomic number, but you have a different mass number, so it's varying in weight. That only comes from the neutrons. So that's an isotope of carbon. So all three of these, carbon 12, carbon 13, and carbon 14, are all the element carbon, but they're isotopes of carbon. So living cells cannot readily distinguish between isotopes of the same element. So consequently, organisms take up and use compounds containing radioactive isotopes in the usual way. Because radioactivity is easily detected and measured by instruments, radioactive isotopes are useful as tracers. So they're there for monitoring the fate of atoms in living organisms. So biologists often use radioactive tracers to follow molecules as they undergo chemical changes in an organism. For example, researchers have used carbon dioxide containing the radioactive isotope carbon-14 to study photosynthesis. Using sunlight to power the conversion, plants take in CO2 from the air and use it to make sugar molecules. So radioactively labeled CO2 has enabled researchers to trace the sequence of molecules made by plants in the chemical route from CO2 to sugar. Radioactive isotopes may also be used to tag chemicals that accumulate in specific areas of the body, such as phosphorus in the bones. After injection of such a tracer, a special camera produces an image of where the radiation collects. So in most diagnostic uses, the patient receives only a tiny amount of an isotope. Substances that the body metabolizes, such as glucose or oxygen, may also be labeled with a radioactive isotope. In this photo, this shows a patient being examined by a PET scan. which can produce images of areas of the body with high metabolic activity. PET scans are useful for diagnosing certain heart disorders and cancers and for basic research on the brain. The early detection of Alzheimer's disease may be a new use for such techniques. This devastating illness gradually destroys a person's memory and ability to think. As the disease progresses, the brain becomes riddled with deposits or plaques of a protein called beta amyloid. Researchers have synthesized a radioactively labeled protein molecule called PIB that binds to beta amyloid plaques and can be detected on a PET scan. So this shows the PET images of the brains of a healthy person on the left and a person with Alzheimer's on the right, injected with the PIB. Notice that the brain of the Alzheimer's patient has high levels of PIB, which is the red and yellow areas, whereas the unaffected person's brain has lower levels, the blue areas. So new therapies are focused on limiting the production of beta amyloid or clearing it from the brain. A diagnostic test using PIB would allow researchers to monitor the effectiveness of new drugs in people living with the disease. Next section that we get into is chemical bonding. The distribution of electrons determines an atom's chemical properties. So to understand how atoms interact with each other, we need to explore atomic structure further. So of the three subatomic particles, a proton, a neutron, and an electron, we need to understand that it is only electrons that are directly involved in the chemical activity of an atom. So what that means is that your electrons are in the outer orbits around the nucleus. So when that happens, and your electrons come into contact with other electrons, they form bonds, and that is our bonding behavior. And our bonding behavior is how we form compounds. So an atom whose outer electron shell is not full tends to interact with other atoms and share, gain, or lose electrons, resulting in attractions called chemical bonding. So when an electron's shell is full on the outside, then it will not bond with other electrons or other atoms because it doesn't need to share, gain, or lose electrons. So therefore, there's no chemical bonds resulting in those reactions. So here in this photo, we just look at the nucleus and we see the electrons in orbit there. And basically, this is just getting you to see how electron distribution is created, okay? So kind of remember the rule. It's called the octet rule. The rule is 288. So what that means is the first ring can hold 2, the second ring can hold 8, and the third ring can hold 8. So if an atom only has one ring, well, that one ring is full if it only has 2. But if it has 2 rings, like this one, for example, this one is not full and stable because it only has 4 electrons in its outer ring. And that means it could hold 4 more. So it could accept 4 more to be stable and full. And of course, we get our number of electrons from the periodic table, which is also our atomic number or our number of protons. So we're not going to go into how to draw these bonds. I'm just trying to explain to you how chemical bonds form. So your electron shell is also called your valence electron shell, is this outer ring, okay? It's the last ring that's drawn for an atom. And depending on how many electrons are in that outer valence ring will depend on if it's going to bond with another atom or not. So just glancing here at this is just showing you orbital diagrams and, again, rings holding the electrons, and if an actual atom is full and satisfied or with a full valence electron shell, or if it's not, it's going to look for other atoms to bond with and therefore form a compound. So in the next section, we talk about covalent bonds joining atoms into molecules through electron sharing. So a molecule consists of two or more atoms held together by covalent bonds. So as shown in the photos, which we're going to get to on the next slide, we'll see the formation of a covalent bond, and we'll see. So the sharing of electrons in covalent bonds, however, is not always equal. So with a covalent bond, two hydrogen atoms, each with an unpaired electron, they share a pair of electrons. So covalent bonding is sharing. So an atom's electronegativity is a measure of its attraction for shared electrons. In a covalent bond between two atoms of the same element, the electrons are shared equally because the two atoms have the same electronegativity. Such bonds are called nonpolar covalent bonds. Atoms of elements that are similar in electronegativity, such as carbon and hydrogen, also share electrons fairly equally between them. When two atoms differ in electronegativity, they form a polar covalent bond. So the negatively charged electrons are drawn more closely to the more electronegative element, and as a result, that atom carries a partially negative charge and the other atom is partially positive. Oxygen is one of the most electronegative elements and is usually involved in polar covalent bonds. An ion is an atom or molecule with an electrical charge resulting from gain or loss of one or more electrons. So two ions with opposite charges, they attract one another, and when that attraction holds the ions together, it's called an ionic bond. So a salt, for example, is an ionic compound, NaCl. So here in this example, you've got Na and you've got Cl, you've got sodium and you've got chlorine. Their ions are attracted because, and they bond to form a compound because, as I mentioned earlier, their outer valence electron shell is not completely full without one another. So sodium, for example, has one electron in that third ring that could hold 8, and chlorine only has 7, so it could use one more. So when they bump into one another in nature, per se, that one electron in sodium is attracted to chlorine because chlorine says, hey, I can use this electron and I would be full and stable with 8. Well, then if sodium loses that electron, then it can drop that outer valence ring, and then it only has the first 2 rings with 2 and then 8. So then it's stable and happy. So in other words, that's how we get table salt, sodium chloride, NaCl, because both of them are bonded together and they make one another stable and happy, and that's an ionic bond. So you can see here in the last part of this diagram how we form sodium chloride when sodium drops that outer ring and gives that one little electron to chlorine, who gains it. So one is losing and one is gaining, and we formed an ionic bond. So in this section, we talk about hydrogen bonds. So in living organisms, most of the strong chemical bonds are covalent, linking atoms to form a cell's molecules. But crucial to the functioning of a cell are weaker bonds within and between molecules, such as the ionic bonds that we just discussed. One of the most important types of weak bonds is the hydrogen bond. So hydrogen atoms of a water molecule are attached to oxygen by polar covalent bonds. Because of these polar bonds and the wide V shape of the molecule, water is a polar molecule. That is, it has an unequal distribution of charges. It is slightly negative at the oxygen end of the molecule and slightly positive at each of the 2 hydrogen ends. So this partial positive charge allows each hydrogen to be attracted to and sense with their nearby atom that has a partial negative charge. So your cells are constantly rearranging molecules in chemical reactions, so breaking existing chemical bonds and forming new ones. A simple example of a chemical reaction is the reaction between hydrogen gas and oxygen gas that forms water. So in this case, two molecules of hydrogen react with one molecule of oxygen to produce two molecules of water. So in this situation here, we get to talking about reactants and products. So the composition of matter is changed as bonds are broken and formed to convert reactants to products. So chemical reactions do not create or destroy matter. They only rearrange it in various ways. So in this figure, the covalent bonds represented here as white sticks between the atoms, holding hydrogen atoms together in hydrogen gas and holding oxygen atoms together in oxygen gas are broken, and new bonds are formed to yield the water product molecules. So organisms cannot make water from hydrogen gas and oxygen gas, but they do carry out a great number of chemical reactions that rearrange matter in significant ways. So let's talk about a chemical reaction that is essential to life on Earth, known as photosynthesis. The raw materials of photosynthesis are carbon dioxide, which is CO2, which is taken from the air, and the water, which plants absorb from the soil. Within green plants, sunlight powers the conversion of these reactants to the sugar product glucose and oxygen, a byproduct that the plant releases into the air. The following chemical formula here shows this in demonstration. So we can trace water's life supporting properties to the structure and interactions of its molecules, their polarity, and the resulting hydrogen bonding between molecules. So hydrogen bonds between molecules of liquid water last for only a few trillionths of a second, yet at any instant many molecules are hydrogen bonded to others. This tendency of molecules of the same kind to stick together is called cohesion, and it is much stronger for water than for most other liquids. The cohesion of water is important in the living world. Trees, for example, depend on the cohesion to help transport water and nutrients from their roots to their leaves. The evaporation of water from a leaf exerts a pulling force on water within the veins of the leaf. Because of the cohesion, the force is relayed all the way down to the roots. Then you have adhesion, which is the clinging of one substance to another. This also plays a role. So as an example of the theme of structure and function, the thinness of a plant's veins enhances the adhesion of water to its cell walls, helping it counter the downward pull of gravity. So related to cohesion is surface tension. This is a measure of how difficult it is to stretch or break the surface of a liquid. Hydrogen bonds give water unusually high surface tension, making it behave as though it were coated with an invisible film. So you can observe the surface tension of water by slightly overfilling a glass. The water will stand above the rim. That is an example of surface tension. Thermal energy is the energy associated with the random movement of atoms and molecules. Thermal energy in transfer from a warmer to a cooler body of matter is defined as heat. Temperature measures the intensity of heat, that is, the average speed of molecules in a body of matter. If you have ever burned your finger on a metal pot while waiting for the water in it to boil, you know that the water heats up much more slowly than the metal. In fact, because of the hydrogen bonding, water has a stronger resistance to temperature change than most other substances. Heat must be absorbed to break hydrogen bonds, and heat is released when hydrogen bonds form. To raise the temperature of water, hydrogen bonds between water molecules must be broken before the molecules can move faster. Thus, water absorbs a large amount of heat while warming up only a few degrees. Conversely, when water cools, water molecules slow down and more hydrogen bonds form, releasing a considerable amount of heat. Earth's giant water supply moderates temperatures, helping to keep temperatures within limits that permit life. Oceans, lakes, and rivers store a large amount of heat from the sun during warm periods. Heat given off from gradually cooling water warms the air. That's why coastal areas generally have milder climates than inland regions. Water's resistance to temperature change also stabilizes ocean temperatures, creating a favorable environment for marine life. Because water accounts for approximately 66% of your body weight, it also helps moderate your temperature. So when a substance evaporates, changes physical state from a liquid to a gas, for example, the surface of the liquid that remains behind cools down. This evaporative cooling occurs because the molecules with the greatest energy, the hottest ones, leave. It's as if the 10 fastest runners on the track team left school, lowering the average speed of the remaining team. Evaporative cooling helps prevent some land-dwelling organisms from overheating. Evaporation from a plant's leaves keeps them from becoming too warm in the sun, just as sweating helps dissipate our excess body heat. Water exists on Earth in three forms: a gas, which is a water vapor, liquid, and a solid. Unlike most substances, water is less dense as a solid than it as a liquid. As you might guess, the unusual property is due to the hydrogen bonds. As water freezes, each molecule forms stable hydrogen bonds with its neighbors, holding them at arm's length and creating a three-dimensional crystal. And this, of course, is why water floats, because ice is less dense than water. If you add a teaspoon of salt to a glass of water, the salt will eventually dissolve, forming a solution. A solution is a liquid consisting of a uniform mixture of two or more substances. The dissolving agent is the solvent, and a substance that is dissolved is a solute. An aqueous solution is one in which water is the solvent. Water's versatility as a solvent results from the polarity of its molecules. So the positively charged hydrogen ends of the water molecules are attracted to negative chlorine ions. In this next picture that we're going to show, we're going to demonstrate the crystal of a salt. So here in this example, again, the positive charged hydrogen ends of the water molecule are attracted to the negative chloride ions, and the oxygen end of the water molecules with their partial negative charge cling to the positive sodium ions. Working inward from the surface of each salt crystal, water molecules eventually surround and separate all the ions, and water dissolves other ionic compounds as well. Seawater, for instance, contains a great variety of dissolved ions, as do your cells. So a compound doesn't need to be ionic to dissolve in water. A spoonful of sugar will also dissolve in a glass of water. Polar molecules such as sugar dissolve as water molecules surround them and form hydrogen bonds with their polar regions. Even large molecules such as proteins can dissolve if they have ionic or polar regions on their surface. As the solvent inside all cells, in blood and in plant sap, water dissolves an enormous variety of solutes necessary for life. In liquid water, a very small percentage of the water molecules dissociate or break apart into hydrogen ions and hydroxide ions. These ions are very reactive, and changes in their concentrations can drastically affect a cell's proteins and other complex molecules. Some chemical compounds contribute additional hydrogen to an aqueous solution, whereas others remove hydrogen from it. A substance that donates hydrogen ions to solutions is called an acid. An example of a strong acid is hydrochloric acid, the acid in the gastric juice in your stomach. An acidic solution has a higher concentration of hydrogen than hydroxide. A base is a substance that reduces the hydrogen ion concentration of a solution. Some bases, such as sodium hydroxide, do this by donating hydroxide. The hydroxide combines with hydrogen to form water, thus reducing the hydrogen concentration. Sodium hydroxide is a common ingredient in oven cleaners. Other bases accept hydrogen ions from solution, resulting in a higher hydroxide concentration. So we use the pH scale to describe how acidic or basic a solution is. Each pH unit represents a 10-fold change in the concentration of hydrogen in a solution. For example, lemon juice at pH of 2 has 10 times more hydrogen than an equal amount of Coke at pH of 3, and 100 times more hydrogen than tomato juice at pH of 4. Carbon dioxide is the main product of fossil fuel combustion, and its steadily increasing release into the atmosphere is linked to climate change. About 25% of this carbon dioxide is absorbed by the oceans, and this naturally occurring remedy to excess CO2 would seem to be a good thing. However, as CO2 levels on the planet continue to rise, the increasing absorption of CO2 is threatening to harm marine life and ecosystems. In ocean acidification, CO2 dissolving in seawater lowers the pH of the ocean. Recent studies estimate that the pH of the oceans is 0.1 pH unit lower now than at any time in the past 420,000 years, and may rapidly drop another 0.3 to a 0.5 pH unit from the current level of 8.1 by the end of this century. As seawater acidifies, the extra hydrogen ions combine with carbonate ions to form bicarbonate ions. So this reaction reduces the carbonate ion concentration available to corals and other shell-building animals. So in a controlled experiment, scientists looked at the effect of decreasing carbonate ion concentration on the rate of calcium depositing by reef organisms. The lower the concentration of carbonate ions, the lower the rate of calcification, and thus the slower the growth of coral animals. The emergent properties of water support life on Earth and may contribute to the potential for life to have evolved on other planets. And the rest of these slides are just simply a review of the chapter.